And our speaker is Dr. Peter Colosi. Dr. Peter Colosi gained his PhD in philosophy from the International Academy. From 1999 to 2007, he taught philosophy as assistant professor at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, the Austrian program. He was the main organizer of the first international symposium of the theology of the body held in Gaming in Austria in 2007. He was also a speaker at this event. This fall, he will be joining St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia as a faculty member. Thank you for specifying that. Dr. Colosi will speak on the ethical problem, which will look at the question of contraception and how it can be answered by understanding the reality of the language of the body. So please welcome Dr. Colosi for his talk.
Okay. Thank you, Damien. Thank you. Thank you all. The assignment that I was given by the team, who are doing a great job, which I'm really appreciative of. It's beautiful, the conference, was to talk about the texts from 118 to 125 in Theology of the Body. And one thing that would help me greatly is if you could take out of your packet the handout that has, because I don't have the PowerPoint, but I want to read a few quotes to get into the text with you. It's the one that has on the front Donnie McManus, Theology of the Body and Art in Pope John Paul II, and my texts are in the back of that handout. And for the first part of my talk, I want to read, and I would like you to read along with it. So it says Peter J. Colosi there on it, if you can find it. While you're looking for my talk in there, the ethical problem, I'll tell you that my talk today is going to be broken into 3 parts. Is that good? Okay. The first part is just going to be a close examination of the text I was assigned. And it seems to me that in that text, which we're going to read together, John Paul is doing 2 things. He is teaching us something about the history of the debate about artificial birth control within the Catholic Church. He's teaching us about the history of the debate of artificial birth control within the Catholic Church, and he's setting out his parameters within which he is going to deal with that question in these passages of Theology of the Body. And I thought that what we could do to start is, so if you have found the handout with the title of my talk, if you could just turn it over on the back of the first page of my talk, I'm going to read the relevant passage. It's the top quote, maybe the most famous passage from Humanae Vitae, and the one that John Paul II wants to talk about. See, Humanae Vitae, came out in the 60s, and so did Gaudium et Spes. Technology had made artificial birth control widely accessible and very inexpensive. So Catholics wanted to know, can we use this within marriage or not? And this is the text that the Church answered that question with. The Church teaches that each and every marriage act must remain through itself open to the transmission of life. That teaching, often set forth by the magisterium, is founded upon the inseparable connection willed by God and unable to be broken by man on his own initiative between the 2 meanings of the conjugal act, the unitive meaning and the procreative meaning. So the Church answered the question, no, you can't use artificial birth control within marriage, and this is the reason why. Now, if you look just down a little bit on that same page, Theology of the Body, number 118.3, I have them numbered there, John Paul sets out his first parameter. He says, the considerations I'm about to propose will refer particularly to the passage of the encyclical that deals with the 2 meanings of the conjugal act and their inseparable connection. That's the passage I just read to you. I do not intend, he says, to present a commentary on the whole encyclical, but rather to explain one passage at greater depth. Just below that, I'd like to read 118.6. This is from John Paul II. Since the conjugal act at one at the same time, you could say here's his brief definition of the two meanings. At one and the same time deeply unites husband and wife, that's the unitive meaning, and together makes them able to generate new lives, that's the procreative meaning. And since one, as well as the other thing, comes about by its innermost structure, it follows with the necessity proper to reason that the human person should read at one and the same time the two meanings of the conjugal act, and also the inseparable connection between the two meanings of the conjugal act. Okay, so it's very clear what he wants to talk about here, these two meanings and how they relate to the question. Now, if you could just turn it back to the front page. Sorry about the confusion here. We'll come back to these quotes in a minute, but what I've done here on the front page in my introduction is, and it was very helpful to be assigned this text because it forced me to kind of think this through. It seems to me that in this debate about artificial birth control within the Catholic Church, see, in the early, even though Gaudium et Spes and Humanae Vitae came out in the 1960s, the discussion of the two meanings was going on since the 1920s. There's one book in particular by Dietrich von Hildebrand called In Defense of Purity, which really generated a deep discussion of this unitive meaning, and I highly recommend that book. And it seems that three positions kind of crystallized out of that discussion, both before and, unfortunately, after the Church pronounced. And the first two I've grouped together under heading number 1 there. So these first two positions are problematic. These first two positions are based on an acceptance of the assertion that talk of the unitive meaning opens the door to artificial birth control. Because before Gaudium et Spes and Humanae Vitae, and before all these discussions in the last century, the Church typically presented the moral teaching on artificial birth control by speaking about the end of marriage as the procreation of children. And she still has that teaching about the end of marriage. But what we have now in these documents, you could say, is a genuine case of development of doctrine. Okay? Now, as this idea of the unitive meaning got expressed and talked about before it appeared in Gaudium et Spes and Humanae Vitae, a group of, you could say, dissenting theologians argued that since we have now these two meanings, that must mean that artificial birth control is acceptable for Catholics to use. A quick way to get at maybe the line of their argument is to say they noticed that there are lots of reasons why a woman won't get pregnant in a particular conjugal act. She might already be pregnant, she might be past menopause, it might be the time of the month when she is not fertile, her husband might be infertile. There are a lot of reasons for that. And so these people noticed, well, look, we have this unitive meaning. Maybe that's what's bearing the moral weight and making the act good in that case. And so they said, let's just add one more thing to the list of reasons why she won't get pregnant, artificial birth control, and say that the unitive meaning can still be present there too, and make it a good act. That's how they were arguing. Now that's false. There's something radically different about artificial birth control than these other reasons, which we're going to talk about. But then another group of thinkers in point B there said, well, they said we should revert to the procreation as the sole end approach and drop the discussion of the two meanings. Because they thought that this unitive dimension, you could say they accepted implicitly the proposition that talking about the unitive meaning would lead to artificial birth control. They thought, you could say, these are people who are against artificial birth control and were glad that Humanae Vitae and Gaudium et Spes rejected artificial birth control, but they weren't particularly pleased by the introduction of the new language of the two meanings. Okay? And they thought, and unfortunately, historically, there was an explosion of birth control use within Catholicism. Okay, and it might have been due to some of the confusion that we're talking about right here. So the thing that these two positions have in common is an acceptance of the principle that talking about the unitive meaning leads to artificial birth control. Now, the third position, which I have labeled there as number 2, is the one of John Paul II. And he, I think, I put this in my own words, but I think you could express it like this. I'll just read it. You can read along if you want. The two meanings approach represents a genuine case of development of doctrine, while its misinterpretation has led to the widespread use of contraception within the Catholic Church. The solution is to express its correct interpretation. That's why I'll just pause for a minute. He set out his parameters, the quote I read before. What did he say? He said, here in Humanae Vitae, and here in Theology of the Body, I want to talk about one little passage, the one that talks about the two meanings and their inseparable connection. Because he noticed that historically, that is what caused all the hubbub in the discussion. So this correct interpretation, he is a rereading, a term he uses over and over again, of many dimensions of love, personhood, the body, and marriage. And this rereading gives a new expression to the foundation of the norm against artificial birth control. This new expression is an example of the type of dialogue that Pope Benedict is talking about above. I have a little quote in italics up there from Pope Benedict XVI, where he says, you could see it there, humanity's desire for fullness cannot be disregarded. The new dialogue between faith and reason required today cannot happen in the terms and in the ways in which it happened in the past. If it does not want to be reduced to a sterile intellectual exercise, it must begin from the present concrete, that's a word that John Paul uses in Theology of the Body all the time too, concrete situation of humanity, and upon this develop a reflection that draws from the ontological metaphysical truth. So John Paul is setting out to express the true meaning of this unitive dimension, which is in line with church teaching on the moral refusal of artificial birth control. Now, if you just turn it over again, I'd like to read a couple more of these quotes. One page over. There's a distinction in these texts between the moral norm. A moral norm is a moral obligation. And our relationship to a moral norm is obedience or disobedience. And the moral norm he's talking about is to not use artificial birth control. That's the answer that the church gave to the question. So we have to obey that. There's a distinction between the moral norm and its reason. That's talked about in 119.3 there. And he says, Humanae Vitae contains the moral norm and its reason, or at least a deeper understanding of what constitutes the reason of the norm. Okay? And the quote right above it, right below that, 118.5, he says, the encyclical does not merely recall or state the norm, but also tries to give it its adequate foundation. The adequate foundation is talking about the reason for the norm. And then if you look down a few quotes below, 119.4, he says, we know what importance anthropology has for ethics. We know what importance anthropology has for ethics. That is, for moral teaching. It seems to be entirely reasonable to look in the theology of the body for the foundation of the truths of the norms concerning such a fundamental issue as man as a body. Now, this word anthropology, it's been coming up a lot during the weekend. Anthropology, it's kind of an ambiguous term. It might make some people think of archaeology of primitive societies or something. But anthropology, in this context, is a branch of philosophy. It's a branch of philosophy. And it could be called philosophy of the human person, or it could be called metaphysics of personal being. That's what he means by anthropology here. And he's saying that in the theology of the body there is, you could say, embedded a philosophical anthropology of personal being, what it means to be a person. And that if this is drawn out and understood, then we will have a deeper foundation, a deeper understanding of the norm against using artificial birth control, using artificial birth control. If you just look down at 120.4 there, in the next part of my talk, I'm not going to be quoting quotes. I'm going to just talk freely in this part 2. But 124 says, the importance of these questions calls for a proportionately weighted and deep answer. If, therefore, it is right on the one hand to expect a penetrating treatment of the norm, so a discussion of the moral law, one can also expect, he says, no less weight to be given to pastoral arguments concerning more directly the life of concrete human beings, like what Pope Benedict said the other up on the quote from the other page. So the norm has been taught, and now John Paul wants to get at the, you could say, the heart of it by looking to this anthropology. And he says this anthropology can be found in this theology of the body. All right. Everything I just said is part one of my talk. It seems to me that that is what is happening in the sections that I was assigned by the team. And I tried to stay close to the text there. Now, if you turn over to the next page, we can start to explore part two of my talk, in which I would like to try to express what this anthropology is, and in particular, to discuss the unity, the intimate unity of the body and soul and persons, the physical and spiritual unity that we are. Now, there in Theology of the Body 3.1 and 133.3, John Paul speaks about contemporary philosophical anthropology. In the first one there, he says in the book of Genesis, we find there in nucleo almost all the elements of the analysis of man to which modern and above all contemporary philosophical anthropology is sensitive. And he says this exploration of man, especially in the aspect of his subjectivity. And in the next one there, 133.3, he says the rooting of the teaching proclaimed by the church in the whole tradition and in divine revelation itself is always open to the questions raised by people and also used